very first, as far back as I can remember, I was drawing on something. I mean, that was just part of me. I cannot explain it. It was just what I like to do. And all through elementary school, high school, and college, that's all I did. And it wasn't until I was in college and I went over to Fort Worth, over to Amon Carter Museum of Western Art, and I ran across Remington and Russell. And from that point on, I was hooked. That's all I wanted to do. So I've been painting historical and Western and landscapes off and on ever since, when I wasn't teaching school. And I taught at Richardson High School in Richardson, Texas, just north of Dallas. That's where I first started teaching, and I went from there over to Sydney, Australia. And I taught New South Wales for 2 years. And I went around the world and I saw everything I could see, and I thought, well, I'm quite knowledgeable about this world and what it looks like. Clyde had his shoes off. He was driving the car barefoot. And Bob Alcorn, this guy here, he hollered down, "Halt." What he was going to say was halt the law, but he never got the law out. Prentice Oakley shot him through the head and killed him instantly. So the car lurched forward about 50 or 60 feet down the road in low gear in the ditch, and it was shot about 150, 180 times. Everybody dumped their weapons in it. They shot it to pieces. I don't know how many times Bonnie and Clyde were hit. A lot of the bullets went through both of them. Probably 25, 30 times. Ted Hinton ran down behind the car. He tried to get around the front. He reached in and he killed the ignition. He tried to get around the front, but he couldn't, so he crawled over the hood. Then he knew Bonnie. Well, let's say he knew both of them. Anyway, he opened the door and Bonnie fell out. And he called her. He said, when I called her, she was still alive. But about a second or two later, said she was dead. I just picked her up and put her back in the seat and pushed her over next to Clyde. What I wanted to do, I've always been interested in history, and art and history that go together. You tell a story about an event that actually happened. So I went out and I got to researching through a lot of the history books. In fact, I took 3 or 4 different history books and I read them on these particular events. And I lined up 5 different pieces that I wanted to do, historical pieces. And this was the first one. This was the Battle of Plum Creek. This was something that actually happened. And I made a piece of art out of it, and I tried to tell a story as how I perceived it to have happened. And that was back around 1840 when the Comanches came down and made the raid on Linville down on the coast, and they burned it to the ground. They totally destroyed it. But what happened to cause that was that the council house in San Antonio, when they were trying to get the prisoners back from the Comanches, and they brought in Matilda Lockhart, and she was in terrible shape. She was like 17 years old, I think, when they returned her. They'd burned her nose off, and they had physically abused the heck out of that kid. And it so incensed the Texans, they told the Indians, they said, well, we're going to hold you captive until you return all of our prisoners. Well, their interpreter told them, said, if you do that, it's going to cause a fight. And they said, do it.
It's John Wayne as Ethan Edwards.
John Wayne in the movie was this guy. But he'd killed his team, he'd killed his horses, and he used them as a barricade against the Indians. Like I say, he'd shot 100 and some odd times before he was killed. But he was a well-known individual at that time in that area. And he was a freighter. He was running freight out to Fort Griffin. And He also ran up to Fort Richardson, which is Jacksboro. But that area in between is where he operated, or was at that time. And this was a cold morning in January. And we gave him a, instead of a bandolier that had the bullets and all on it, he probably had a pouch full of bullets. We just dip into and pull them out as he had to have them. And all these characters back here were rodeo horses and this and that I had a lot of photography on. So I just put them together with information I had about costumes and whatnot of the Plains Indians, which could have been Kiowa, Comanche, or Sioux, or Blackfoot, or anything just about at that time. Tried to make a fairly accurate representation of Indians who would have been in that area. I had a friend of mine who was in and out of the art business up around Rockmore, and we were talking one day, and he said that his ancestors were Norwegian, and there was a Norwegian community out there not too far from Clifton. And they had a church they built back in the 1800s, was still there. So I went down to have a look at it, and I had a buddy of mine who lived about 3 miles back up here, and played ball with him in college. And he took me down there, and we went all over the place and took photographs of the church. They were restoring the church. And there was a big graveyard out here, but I figured out that if it was within a year or two after the church was constructed, there wouldn't have been any graveyard of any amount yet. So I picked one of those improbable snow scenes and put about a 3-inch snow on the ground. The thing about it is, I don't want to perpetuate a lie. I like to see if I can find the truth in what happened and try to do it that way. And I may be wrong, I don't know, because the people involved in this are all dead and gone. So you're just kind of picking pieces of information from people here and there. It's what they perceived or what their ancestors perceived, so you never really know. It's the research, it's putting it together, doing the preliminary work. That's the most thing. Because once you establish what you're going to do, you've done it. Now, the finished part is a lot of work. You just have to carry it through. Because you know what it's going to look like before you get there, because you've already done it. And then it's kind of like when you get through, it's time to put down the hammer and the nails and go get a beer. Of course, you're never satisfied with a piece. You always go back and say, well, I could have made that better. I could have changed that. And sometimes you walk away from it and you come back years later and say, well, I can't believe I did that. That wasn't that bad.